Peace. Welcome to the C.L. Edwards podcast, where we are reimaging the culture, focusing on spirituality, family, work, health, and community. Your host is author, speaker, husband, and father C.L. Edwards. Now, let's get it started.
Assalamu alaikum. This is the C.L. Edwards podcast, back with another episode. And today we have another guest with us. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, when I had the idea to start this podcast, this is one of the individuals I had in mind that I wanted to interview, because I found the website Black Dawah Network and the videos that were on YouTube. Great videos, great content, articles. It really blew my mind, the content, because I hadn't seen anybody in the Muslim community directly address some of these topics the way I've seen you and the brother that you run the website with, which I can't recall his name at the moment.
Brother Muhammad.
Yes, yes.
Attorney Muhammad.
Attorney, yes. I haven't seen anybody in the community address these issues the way that you have, and it was very refreshing. And I think this topic needs to be discussed. I speak to a lot of different brothers, and some brothers who even came out of the Nation of Islam, brothers who came out of the Black consciousness community. Their attitudes range. I've seen some attitudes say, oh, they're not talking about anything. There's no need to discuss. They're nobodies. They're a bunch of grifters and hoteps. So why even discuss what they're talking about? I've seen some brothers just basically take the position of just ignore it and it'll go away. But it doesn't. It's not going away. It's not going away. And we see individuals it's a part of their speaking platform to put forth pseudo history about Islam in Africa and say all types of almost insane things. And it's all types of pseudo science and pseudo history, things like that. And I think the Muslims, we need to be more vocal about addressing some of this stuff, because it's getting a little bit more popular. I'm hearing people in the Black community repeat some of this stuff. It's even starting to get over into Africa. I've seen people in online repeating this stuff who are living in Africa, brothers and sisters. So I think this is the best person, because you have written about this subject, and this is the book right here. This is the book. I have the book. I've actually, to prove I'm reading the book, I just don't have I just didn't bring the brother on, and I haven't actually read the book. I've read the book, and I started rereading it also. So, brother, just let me give an introduction for you so that people know who you are a little bit further. I'm taking some information off the Black Dawah Network website, blackdawahnetwork.com. Shareef Muhammad, a professor of history in Atlanta, Georgia. He has taught at Atlanta Metropolitan College, Georgia State University, and Gwinnett Technical College. He has taught an introduction to the Quran and an introduction to Islam at Spelman College. He has written the book, An Invitation to Islam for Black Martyrs. That's one of the books I want to get next, that discusses the superiority of the Islamic worldview to Black leftist thought. He has lectured on the subject of systemic racism, Black political thought, and the history of Islam in America. Brother, we welcome you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Let's get into it. What is Afrocentrism? Because the word is tossed out a lot. People might think of Dr. Ben. People might think of different individuals when you say that. What exactly is Afrocentrism?
Well, first let me say, thank you for having me on, and important and timely. And actually, when I wrote the book, when I was writing it, I was doubtful about whether or not I should continue, because so much has happened since I was first contacted to write the book. We talk about the jailing of Polite, and the sort of conscious community has become sort of defunct, you could say. So, I was sort of hesitant about actually writing the book, but, as after I wrote it, it seems that it's really caught on and become viewed as timely. The word Afrocentrism is Afrocentrism is a worldview that claims to center the Black experience on the history and supposed culture of Africa. And its origins can be found in the late 1900s with scholars like J. Rogers, Carter G. Woodson, W.E.B. Du Bois. There's a connection being made today between African American identity and ancient Egypt. And you can find that going all the way back to 1911 NAACP publication called The Crisis. The term Afrocentrism first appears there. And in 1962, there's a Encyclopedia Africana. The term Afrocentrism dates back to the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. And that the term has as one of its core ideas the idea that Egypt is the starting point for classical African history in the same way that Greece and Rome is the starting point for classical European history. So when somebody says classical history, classical European history, you're talking about the Greco-Roman era. The idea of making Egypt that for Africa began with Sheikh Anta Diop, who is called the pharaoh of Afrocentrism, although he didn't embrace the term Afrocentrism. He's regarded as sort of the father of this idea. And then later, this became widespread due to Chancellor Williams and his book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, was published in 71. But both of these men were key figures in Afrocentrism. And by the way, there are people like Malifa Asante and Dr. Malifa Asante and the late Dr. Asa Hilliard, who are adamantly opposed to the term Afrocentrism. They say they're African-centered. I even heard Dr. John Henry Clarke make the same statement. But these men, Chancellor Williams, Sheikh Anta Diop, influenced Dr. John Henry Clarke and Dr. Ben, as he's known, who sort of became the vanguard of Afrocentrism. However, the man who is responsible for trying to make, and in fact, to a large degree has, made Afrocentrism an academic enterprise has been who I mentioned, Malifa Asante, who established the first doctoral program of African American Studies at Temple University in 1988. And, listen, Afrocentrism is a vague term that, in my estimation or determination, is deliberately vague. And this is where some of the implicity sort of comes in at. But some of the core ideas of Afrocentrism are that there is a pure African culture that is independent of Arab, European, and Egypt is the focal point of that pure African culture. And that has been expressed in various iterations from the Afrocentrist community to the conscious community, which are not the same.
I was going to ask you about that.
Conscious community, Afrocentrist community is not the same. But that, in a nutshell, is what sort of encapsulates what we're calling Afrocentrism or African-centered.
Jazakallah khair. Now, I was already thinking about that before you even said it. What is, because we're just defining terms at this moment, so people know what we're talking about. What is the difference, or the not so difference, between Afrocentrism, Pan-Africanism, the conscious community?
Pan-Africanism was a political economic movement that had aspect of cultural nationalism to it, but its main focus was the political and economic condition of Black folks throughout the world and sort of tying them back to a central location or headquarters in Africa. In the case of, for example, Marcus Garvey and UNIA. The UNIA, Garvey was trying to do with UNIA was make Liberia a transnational community or a transnational hub or headquarters for Black folks all over the world, particularly in the diaspora, in which they could create businesses and sort of tie them back to Africa via Liberia. It is an attempt to align the political and economic interests of Black people in the diaspora with those on the continent of Africa. And like I said, there was a cultural aspect to it, but the main focus was power, autonomy, self-actualization, and economic development. And when that was the focus, Pan-Africanism had actionable goals and organizations that set out to achieve those goals. Now, around the time that our brother and Shaheed Al-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, rahimahullah, was martyred, the Pan-African movement became defunct, especially as we start heading towards the 80s. Malcolm was the last, in my estimation, great Pan-Africanist because he was actually involved in doing Pan-Africanism. He wasn't interested in going to conferences and talking about what Black folk need to do. He was interested in creating organizations that had political, economic objectives that people would rally around and organize to try to achieve. So when Malcolm was martyred, when he left us, a lot of particularly non-Muslims who were sort of under Malcolm's auspice became sort of loose, out of orbit. One of them was Dr. John Henrik Clarke. You don't know who John Henrik Clarke is, Dr. John Henrik Clarke is, when Malcolm's around, unless you're around Malcolm. You learn who Dr. John Henrik Clarke is after Malcolm leaves, which is before that. And so when Malcolm leaves, when he's martyred, Pan-Africanism as an actionable movement with objective goals becomes defunct. You still have Pan-Africanist organizations, you still have people identifying with it, but it is not on the scale of what Brother Malcolm was trying to effectuate, and certainly was not on the scale of what Garvey was doing. Mm-hmm. So what takes its place, or what emerges in its wake, is what became known and began to be identified as Afrocentrism. So Afrocentrism emerges out of the defunct Pan-Africanist movement. And the people who are sort of vanguard of that Afrocentrist faction are the people who were heavily involved with Malcolm in New York and the East Coast.
Okay.
And I mean, one could even say that, I've even heard some say that Afrocentrism, as we understand it today, emerged as a kind of factionalism within Pan-Africanism. But the point being that when Pan-Africanism stops being the actionable movement that it was during the time under Malcolm, it sort of morphs into what we call Afrocentrism. Now, Afrocentrism, the difference between that and the conscious community is that Afrocentrists at least have the pretense of scholarship. Mm. And many of the mistakes that they've made that I address in the book with regard to Islam can be forgivable given what they were dealing with. Okay. John Henrik Clarke said that his education, John Henrik Clarke did not matriculate through a graduate program. His degree is honorary. He didn't matriculate through a graduate program. You know, he was, by all accounts, an autodidact. He had mentors, but he himself has said that his greatest teacher was the public library.
Mm.
And the question one must ask is, what kind of books on Islam were in the public library in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s? You see what I'm saying? You know, you didn't have Dr. Bilal Ware and Dr. Sherman Jackson and those people. You didn't have that there during that time. So all of the information that anyone would be getting about Islam from the public library, or even, to be perfectly honest with you, the university, the academy, would have been primarily Orientalist sources, which were decidedly biased against Islam and were interested in portraying Islam in a certain negative way, not just a negative way, but a certain negative way. But they read. That's the point. And I mentioned that about, even if you went through, matriculated through a graduate program, you still would have likely been exposed to and inundated with these ideas because Chancellor Williams was Oxford, right? So these people, however, were read. Chancellor Williams, educated, John Henrik Clarke, a voracious reader, Dr. Ben read languages. These individuals had at least the pretense of scholarship. By the time you get to early 2000s and sort of the old guard of Afrocentrists, Dr. Asa Hilliard, John Henrik Clarke, and others have sort of passed, you get a more less literate, coarse, sensational contingents, see, that is really emerging via social media.
Mm-hmm.
Back then you had to get invited to go somewhere to speak, and somebody had to record you speaking, and that recording had to get out. But you first had to have made some waves somewhere to get invited somewhere to speak. You didn't have smartphones and social media where you could just record yourself or somebody record you and it get uploaded and it gets views and likes and that and the other. There had to at least be some kind of labor on your part, to get known, to achieve sort of access to a platform. So what you end up with the conscious community is this sort of crass, uneducated, not very well read, of undisciplined individuals who are just coming out of nowhere. And their primary method of communication is sophistry, such as what you mentioned with Brother Polite
Mm-hmm.
and his, laughable sort of etymology on the word Rahman, Rahim. So you see from Pan-Africanism to Afrocentrism to the conscious community, a de-evolution. The quality gets less and less, and it becomes less about doing and more about being seen and talking.
Yeah, but I noticed that myself. I mean, obviously, with the loss of El Haj Shabazz, that was a great loss to the world, not just the black people. That was a loss to the world. But even you notice that there were Muslims in so-called Black Power movement or the Black Liberation movement with the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army. These brothers and sisters, many of them were Muslim and they were very highly educated, but we know that they were persecuted. Many of them were hunted down. Many of them were in prison. So, like you said, when these people are moved out of the way, a new crop of people come to the forefront. And when the vanguard of that die off, and we got the internet allows anyone. It's a free market to a point where anyone can put up a web page, anyone can create a YouTube and start broadcasting. And what I see from a lot of these guys, and if I watch their content, and I've been actually invited on some of these guys' platforms, is that they're actually largely repeating each other. It's not like if someone is doing some independent study, one person says something and then 10 other people repeat the same exact thing. So one person says something about Islam. I've heard things like, the Arabs, white Arabs came and invaded Kemet, and Kemet was this this marvelous black civilization. You had the Library of Alexandria, all this black knowledge, and these black scientists were there. These white Arabs come, they take over, they burn down the Library of Alexandria, they they convert the people to Islam by the point of the sword. How historical is that type of narrative?
It's completely ahistorical. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Egypt, Kemetic Black Egypt, declines in the third intermediate period. So that's, in the BC era, there's a period between the decline of Egypt. This is about a 1400-year period from the decline of Egypt, ancient Kemetic Egypt, to the birth of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, the idea that ancient Egypt was destroyed by Kemetic Egypt was destroyed by Arab invasion shows how indifferent they are to the facts of history. I mean, ancient Kemet was destroyed and compromised over a millennium prior to the Arab invasion in 640 ACE, when the Muslims first arrived. And the Kemet that Afrocentrists romanticized had long been gone. When the Muslims arrived, they were entering a country that was in Egypt that was thoroughly Hellenized and Romanized, whose native population was an amalgam of Black Africans, Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Eastern Europeans, whole populations of Italians, and many Vandals and Goths had moved into North Africa during the time of the Emperor Augustine. The Berbers were made lighter than the Europeans when the Europeans moved into North Africa as far back as even the Ice Age. But you had the Hyksos colonization of northern Egypt, which didn't help either as far as sort of making the complexion of the people much lighter. But when we talk about the third intermediate period, the Sea People precipitating the decline and fall of ancient Egypt, and then you had the Phoenicians, you had the Romans, you had the Vandals, you had the Persians, the Greeks. Egypt was conquered successively 5 times between the time that it fell and the birth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So by the time the Arabs arrived in Egypt, it's not the Kemet that Afrocentrists are always glorifying and lamenting. The people in ancient Egypt didn't know anything about it during the time in the 7th century. They were entering into Roman territory, not native Black Kemetic territory. And to give you sort of a stark realization of what I just said and how it impacted this event, when Amr ibn Asan, who was the general that led the Muslims into Egypt, dispatched his envoy, his ambassador, Ubayd, to sort of negotiate the surrender of the Copts, because the whole reason the Arabs went into Egypt was to confront Rome. The 2 superpowers at the time who posed a threat to the newly created Muslim state, Rome and Persia. And Muslims go into Egypt because Egypt is the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Egypt is the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. So they go into Egypt and encounter the native Coptic Christian population and negotiate a surrender of them, giving them the three options that Muslim armies generally gave. You convert to Islam. You don't want to convert to Islam. You accept a position as or a status as a dhimmi, where you're not Muslim. You get to keep your faith, practice your traditions as you want. You just pay a tax, right? And then the other is, war. We fight. Well, they were under Roman occupation, and they were actually being persecuted. The Coptic Egyptian Christians were being persecuted by the Roman Catholic Church. And so the archbishop, chose to take dhimitude and pay the tax to the Muslims. But interesting enough, when he encountered this native Coptic Christian, encountered the envoy or ambassador of Amr, the Muslims, the Arabs, the first thing he said to the Arabs is, take this black man away from me. I can have nothing to do with him. That's a very strange statement for a native black Kemetic Egyptian to make to an Arab. Mm-hmm. But you find this event being translated and narrated at full in the book written by Alfred J. Butler entitled Arab Invasion, the last 30 years of Roman dominion, where he goes into great detail about that event. So the Egypt that the Afrocentrists are saying that the Arabs compromised and destroyed was compromised and destroyed over 1,000 years before the Prophet Muhammad was even born. Egypt and the Muslims and Islam never passed each other in the corridor of history. Mm. They didn't exist on the earth at the same time. Mm. The Muslim community and ancient Kemetic Egypt weren't on the earth at the same time. So this is another example of the kind of just woeful ignorance that you find in a lot of Afrocentrist and conscious community circles.
Mm. Mm. So what you just told us completely flies in the face of this whole entire narrative. It's like, if somebody says, and I've heard people say this numerous times, like, where do people get this from? Where a narrative like that about, white Arabs coming to destroy Kemet? Do you have any idea where did that even originate from, or is it just something that kind of like a snowball came together with different people saying and people adding information to it?
There are some Orientalists who speculated that the Arabs destroyed the library of Alexandria, but that has since been debunked. Mm-hmm. The problem with Afrocentrists is, and those in the conscious community, one Afrocentrist will read something.
Okay.
And not have a comprehensive evaluation of the historiography, which is the history of how the history is written. You have history, which is the facts of what took place, but then you have historiography, which is how those facts have been interpreted and written. And so you have somebody going into a book, getting a single iteration, and not having a context in how that book or that particular statement fits within the evolution of the subject, the scholarship on the subject. So and this is very common among not just Afrocentrist circles, but it's especially true of the conscious community, where they will take a discredited theory on the origin of something that Europeans and Western scholars have discarded because they debunked it and they moved on. They'll take that theory and rummage through the trash, take that theory, sort of rub it off, clean it off, and then put it back in circulation.
So it seems to me like Afrocentrism and Black consciousness is heavily dependent on Eurocentric history. Is that fair to
It's
say?
entirely a Eurocentric, it's entirely a Western, European and Western construct. And it's conceptualized, it's what it uses for conceptualization are assumptions about anthropology and history within Eurocentric, European thought. So that's the whole irony of Afrocentrism. What I try to tackle in the book is that it is more European than it is African.
That sounds crazy. I'm sorry. That just sounds, and that probably.
Let's look at it like this. Let's look at it like this. If you're making Egypt the centerpiece of your worldview,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't choose to pick up where Sheikh Anta left off, and all you really have to go on are Sir Wallace Bulge and other European Egyptologists. You're accessing ancient Kemet. You believe you're accessing ancient Kemet through the ideological filter of European translators.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only way you can access. How else has the Medu Neter been translated by anyone other than European translators?
It's a good point. It's a good point.
So you're viewing ancient Egypt through the lens of European translators. And to whatever degree you're trying to overcorrect what you perceive to be their Eurocentrism imposing, you can't possibly know with absolute certainty where intellectual integrity and accuracy begins and their Eurocentric bias ends.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask this. So if the conscious community, Afrocentrists, are taking African history from Eurocentric sources unfiltered, when it comes to Islam itself, when it comes to Islam, Islamic history, Islamic theology, the cultures of Muslims, Islam in Africa, if they're also taking that perspective from Eurocentrists and from Orientalists, what is the Orientalist Eurocentric view of Islam or a view of Islam in Africa that probably has filtered into Afrocentrism and the Black consciousness community? Is it problematic?
Well, not all Orientalist perceptions of or writings and takes on Islam are negative. Okay. Some of them are very laudatory, in fact, of Muslims and Islam. The entire Orientalist project is not anti-Muslim. However, that doesn't nullify the fact that Orientalist studies in the UK have their origin in the British colonialist project in India, and is a colonialist and has a colonialist agenda in how things were interpreted. I talk about, I don't want to get in too much detail, but I talk about in the book how the British general, who I mentioned in the book, at the time that the British were settling and setting up in India, were having problems with the Muslims. And what they did, this is after the Mughal Empire, where Muslims and Hindus functioned pretty much in harmony for a long period of time. The British general would pretty much launch a campaign to get the Hindus to see Islam as foreign to India and derisive and anti-traditional Indian religions and culture.
We see that coming down right now.
Yes. So turning the the Hindu population against the Muslims, because the Hindu
Mm.
population was larger, was a way for the British general and the British army to secure their power and foothold in the Indian subcontinent. And that tact, and in doing that, they also brought with it a the creation of the Institute for Orientalist Studies,
Okay.
which would translate things from Sanskrit into the Romance languages, but more specifically English.
Mm.
And so you could actually trace this whole I'm spiritual, not religious, to that project indirectly. You could trace it to that project, but a lot of other things. I mean, the the sort of interest that bourgeois elite in America have with Indian cultural features
Mm-hmm.
like yoga, namaste, the word karma making its way into the American English lexicon. A lot of this is stemming from the fact that Britain was the first to translate Indian religious and spiritual concepts out of Sanskrit into English.
Mm.
And it just spread throughout the UK, and then, of course, it makes its way into, and there's a resurgence of it with the countercultural movement during the 60s. But yeah, Orientalist studies had a monopoly on the literature on Islam in the English world, the English speaking world. So if you were learning about Islamic history, during the 40s, 50s, and even 60s, there was no way you were not going to be heavily exposed, inundated, and even indoctrinated by this Orientalist take on Islam, which, as I said, was decidedly critical due to the fact that they had an agenda to unseat or neutralize the Muslims in the regions where British colonialism was spread.
Now you touched on a topic I want to go in this direction. We also see out of the Afrocentrism and also out of the Black consciousness community, a kind of like a spiritualist narrative. Kind of many people who take this philosophy are anti-religion, and they would decidedly say that I am spiritual, not religious. Black people should be spiritual, not religion. Religion is something that has been detrimental to Black people. Africans were not religious. Religion didn't come from Africa. Religion came from the white man. Religion came from the white Arab. They would group Islam and Christianity and Judaism all together as Abrahamic faiths, and all the damage and warfare and murder that the Abrahamic faiths have done, and they would group Islam in with that. So you touched on it, but I'd like to go back to this point about the origin of this whole concept of I'm spiritual, not religious. A little bit of reading that I've done, I know that there was like this spiritualist movement that took place with Europeans in the 1800s. Um, and people like Madame Blavatsky and all these people who took concepts from India, who took concepts from ancient Egypt, which is it seems to be like a little connection there. I don't know. What would you say on
Yeah,
that?
the framing of religion versus African spirituality is a
Mm-hmm.
Western invention that has its origins in the theosophical movements of the
Mm.
late 1800s. Theosophy, for those who don't know, is a idea in the 19th century that knowledge of God can be achieved through direct intuition, ecstasy, drugs, hedonism. The leader of this movement was a Russian woman named Helena Blavatsky and her companion, her cohort, Henry Olcott. The point is that the concept of spirituality here, and as it's being used in today's popular culture, is not indigenous to Africa. And
Mm.
it doesn't have any real historical genealogy or merit. So if you ask any of these people, how are you defining religion? They will not be able to give you a concise, coherent definition that will not change if you ask them the same question later. And if we take, and that's because the term religion itself was not used until around the 1200s. It's a Anglo-Norman Old French term, which means to tie back, to reconnect, to tie back to. And that in itself has some value, some merit. But the point is that from a purely sort of analytical standpoint, their use of the term religion is useless because it doesn't convey, you cannot examine this in history the way that they're ascribing it. So if we take religion to mean a set of beliefs with rites, rituals, ceremonies, sacrifices, taboos, then Africans most certainly dealt with religion and continue to deal with religion because African societies have rites, rituals, ceremonies, sacrifices, taboos, and cosmology, or what you would call today doctrine. Mm-hmm. So what are you really saying here when you say Africans didn't deal with religion, Africans dealt with spirituality? Well, what you really are doing is you're negatively signaling down the Abrahamic faith, what you call the Abrahamic faith traditions, which is itself a contemporary construct of a term. But you're really talking about Islam, Christianity. And when you mentioned before the violence that, and this is also a common thing that you find in popular Western culture, more wars have been fought in the name of religion than anything else. My take on that, as is most historians, is that religion is integral to the creation and building of civilization. The process of building civilization is violence. So when you say that religion is, you recount all these wars that religion has taken place in, these wars were not wars that were fought largely over differences with regard to theology, but they were wars that contributed to the creation of new kingdoms, new empires, and a change in geographical political boundaries. So these religions are, and I'm mentioning Islam and Christianity in particular because that's what these centrists and conscious community and critics are referring to. Show me the civilization or nation that was built on their loose definition of spirituality. That is an idea or a concept that does not have rites, rituals, ceremonies, and doctrine. Show me this amorphous, nebulous concept of spirituality that you're claiming Africans believed in, that is the pure African way, disposition, and how or what it's inspired politically. Doesn't exist. So when we talk about a lot of these accusations that are made about Islam are really sort of acknowledgments of the indelible role that these faith traditions have played in statecrafting. Mm-hmm. But, now, I just want to touch lastly on the notion of being spiritual and not religious. Mm-hmm. Because the term spiritual, in Islam, it's taught that the human being is a spirit with a body, not a body with a spirit. So because we are spirits with bodies, souls, everything that we do is spiritual. So the term, the reference, or the boast, I am spiritual, is really, being spiritual is the laziest thing you can do. because everything you're doing is spiritual. Spirituality can be anything from prayer, meditation, to shooting dope. Because it is everything that you do is vicariously done through the body by the spirit. So everything is spiritual. So it's a very equivocating term that has no real merit when you actually drill down and look at it. The real issue that many have with the concept of religion is responsibility that one has spirituality. And if you look at a lot of these people who are touting this religion versus spirituality dichotomy, a lot of these people, if you ask them, what do you do spiritually? They can't tell you. Or when they do tell you, it's something like going to the pond and breathing. It has no social, political, economic import whatsoever. So it's the idea of I'm spiritual, not religious, is kind of a way out of having to actually do things that one can be held accountable to. If I say I'm Muslim, you can go look and see what that is, and then look at it, and then look at me, and make a judgment about me. If you say you're spiritual, not religious, it's a way to weasel out of any kind of accountability.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be responsible for your spirituality the way I have to be responsible for being Muslim, or someone has to be responsible for being Jewish, or being Christian, or being Buddhist, or practicing the religion of the Dogon, or practicing the religion of the Xhosa people, or practicing. You understand what I'm saying? If you go to people in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, the Bantu, the Maasai, and you talk to them, and I'm not talking about the people in the city, because you mentioned that you find even among Africans on continental Africa, they're saying some of they're repeating some of these iterations. I'm talking about if you go to the people in the pastoral areas on the outskirts beyond the city limits, and you talk to them about this religion versus spiritual debate, they have no clue what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Not only do they have no clue what you're talking about, they are not invested in the debate or the discussion. So when you said that you have Africans who are, repeating some of the same things that originated here with Afrocentrism in the conscious community, it's among those Africans who are in the city who have been exposed to Western culture.
Who have the internet connection.
Have the internet connection. So you're talking about the pastoral herdsmen, those who are away from electricity,
Mm-hmm.
television media, right? They have nothing invested in the debate.
Those were incredible points. The spirituality versus religion. And I hear people when I have conversations with people, one, they can't define religion, just like you said. Religion could just be anything. Whatever I don't like is religion. If I don't like something, that's religion, and I'm not that. I'm spiritual. Also, the whole idea of not wanting to be responsible. I mean, I was Christian. I was raised Christian. I actually attended a seminary, and I was going to be a Christian elder and pastor. So, and I was a Christian apologist as well. And I can say, I know for certain, Islam is a very, the way people perceive Islam, people usually perceive Muslims as being disciplined people. That's the one thing, even in the Black community and outside the Black community, when I speak to non-Muslims, that's usually the first or second thing they'll say they'll talk about the discipline that it takes, praying 5 times a day, waking up in the morning to pray Fajr, or fasting for Ramadan. I don't know if I can do that, is what I hear from people. So there is this perception of being rigorous and being disciplined. And when people talk about I'm just spiritual, well, spiritual, like you said, it could be anything. Whatever I feel, whatever I like, whatever makes me feel good is spiritual, and I don't have a responsibility to a God to submit to, and I don't have a responsibility to a community. I don't have any responsible to a community of people either. So I can,
Dopamine is spiritual. So addictions are spiritual.
mhm. Yeah, and the other point you made about the way most Africans would perceive this whole conversation, they wouldn't know what you're talking about. Even, you know, people like Shaka Utmost is an individual who's in the consciousness community, and he talks about these type of things. Young Pharaoh, these other individuals, we see from them, they'll talk about African spirituality or Kemetics, and it seems to be a very reductionist concept of what African spirituality would be, or what Kemetics would be. Would a, if somebody could get beamed, sci-fi, beamed back into ancient Kim, and they would come to the temples, to the ancient Kemetic priests, and saying, I'm not religious, I'm just spiritual. I'm not into organized religion. What do you think they would say to this person?
I have no idea what you're talking about, who you are, why you're here, where did you come from. But if you want to study with us, there are a series of tasks you will have to complete. You're not just going to walk by without saying that you follow Ma'a. That's not how that works. You have to be initiated into this as a neophyte, and you have to matriculate through the levels that we have in place. And each level will have things that you will need to do, sacrifices that you will need to make, rituals that you will need to learn how to perform and enact, and things that you will have to abide by and believe. So, from the very generic sense of the word, that satisfies the definition of a religion.
Mm-hmm.
What I think is interesting, though, is with the individuals that you mentioned, young Pharaoh and others, you notice how none of the so-called Afrocentrists and those in the conscious community, when they identify with Egypt, notice how none of them ever identify with the average, everyday member of Kemet. It's always the pharaoh or the queen or, the mystery schools. But what do they say about the average, everyday subject in ancient Kemet who his, crops weren't going to yield what he thought they were during that year, and the brutal tax collectors were going to come by and take what little he had anyway. They never deal with the reality of these civilizations. It's always a sort of romantic view of them, an idealistic view of them, and it's really intended to satisfy what I think is a kind of inferiority complex. The thing about Islam is its rituals, its sacrifices, its rites, its ceremonies, on a daily basis, its taboos, the discipline, the moral framework and discipline that accompanies it, ennobles the average everyday person to where and you can attest to this, you could be in the middle of, the hood, and, you're sort of perceived in this sort of regal manner, and you're approached differently because of the code of conduct that it imposes on you. Now, the book that I wrote is not a critique of Africa. It's a critique on Afrocentrists.
Mm.
That's very important. It is not a censure or referenda on indigenous African cultures or African business practices. It is a critique of the way in which those who claim to be centered on these societies and practices, in fact, aren't.
Okay.
That they're engaged in a kind of intellectual fraud, both defrauding themselves and others, but primarily defrauding themselves. But when we go back and you actually try your best to learn about, for example, ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt, aside from the sort of sensational aspects here in the West of the building of the pyramids, and there was the average Egyptian life, where the average Egyptian man and woman toiled under harsh, challenging conditions with as much dignity and determination as they possibly could. But to sort of segue into the next subject, one of the things that I want to point out is one of the reasons there is this fixation with ancient Egypt is because of white Western fixation with ancient Egypt. And that cannot be denied.
Mm.
That this idea that civilization is temples and tablets, writing and architecture, and the fixation that the esteem with which Westerners have for ancient Egypt is something that has sort of driven a lot of Afrocentrists, people who identify as Afrocentrists, in that direction. You hear them very seldom speak about, the people of the ancient civilizations of the Congo, Kosa, others. Their fixation even with the Dogon is connected to the fact that the Dogon are connected to ancient Egypt. Mm. So there is not just an adoption of Eurocentric ideas, but a Eurocentric impetus and motive for where their interests take them.
I've noticed that also. I was going to point out, from a European standpoint, you mentioned, Europe, the UK, England being in India, and we see like a commercialization of certain aspects of Indian religion, like the whole thing with yoga. Yoga has been really stripped down, deconstructed, and commercialized. It's not like the yoga that a yogi would practice in India. It's kind of like minivan moms going to do stretching and something. I almost see a connection, a similar thing with the Black consciousness community, where they'll talk about Kemetics, they'll talk about African spirituality, but they're not embracing all of it. They're not really embracing very few. There's a couple who claim that they've been inducted into mysteries. For the most part, people aren't really embracing a particular system and all that comes with that system. They're just taking little bits and pieces and regurgitating it. And for themselves, for a lot of these personalities on the internet, they're commercializing it. They're selling products and whatnot. Just let me point out something in your book on page 134, because you before this part you talk about the so-called Arab slave trade, and you talk about African religions, and of course you made the point that you're not criticizing African religions, you're more critiquing Afrocentrists and the consciousness community. And I just want to tie this into the point of them not embracing everything. You talk about female genital mutilation, which is practiced a lot in Africa. You talk about, tell me if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, muti?
Yes.
Muti, which is making amulets, taking body parts off of people. Especially there's been a lot of talk and documentaries about albinos and the threat to albino African people, and which practitioners of certain religions, voodoo, seeking them out to use their body parts and whatnot for magic. I don't see anybody in the Black consciousness community embracing any of that.
No, or the fact that those who want to identify with the royal class of ancient Kemet don't practice incest.
Yeah.
So, it's one of these things where, upon a closer look, you're not serious. And the people who sort of are driven to this are people who are not serious. If you're actually going to hold everyone, if you're actually going to judge people's racial bona fides using this standard of pure Africanity, you yourself have to, at the very least, meet the standard.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that the standard is an adulteration, and the people themselves who advocate the standard don't scrupulously adhere to it. Most Afrocentrists do not adhere to a traditional African religion. Hence, the term spirituality, African spirituality, was created so that they would not have to do that. They could claim, well, I subscribe to the principles that are inherent to all traditional African religion. But that's not the way it works in Africa.
No. And how would you even designate what the principles are if you're not a part of the system? If you're not learned and part of the system, how are you qualified to say what the principles are?
And whatever principles that are consistent throughout traditional African religion doesn't count because someone from here can't perform a ritual over here. In this, so part of what my critique of traditional of Afrocentrists and the conscious community is that they are not respecting the way in which things are actually done in Africa by alluding to a sort of amorphous African spirituality. They speak of it as though we can't go there and see how it's actually practiced and carried out.
And let me transition to another lane. I also see among them is that they like to claim Mansa Musa. They like to claim the Songhai Empire. From one aspect, they want to acclaim their achievements. Then they want to denigrate their religion at the same as that time, which seems twisted in my mind. And they also want to put forth the idea that Islam came and destroyed African traditional spirituality, and they're reviving it. You can see with just a little bit of reading that these great African Islamic empires didn't eradicate the indigenous religions, and sometimes they live side by side with each other. So that whole narrative, can you touch on that? How is it that you can embrace the achievements of these societies and denigrate their religion, or claim that their religion won't uplift African Americans, or it's standing in the way of achievement of Africans? And how can you claim that it destroyed African spirituality when African spirituality still exists to this day, and it existed during the time of these empires?
At the heart of what they are saying is why aren't traditional African religions, which is itself, that term is a Orientalist construct, the idea of traditional African religion. But at the heart of what they're getting at is why, and I've heard them articulate this, why have traditional African religions not been able to compete with Islam and Christianity, and why should they have to compete with Islam and Christianity on the continent of Africa? And the point I make is that tribal religions has nothing to do with them being African. Tribal religions are not designed to compete with world religions. Tribal religions, what do we mean? We mean that rites, rituals, sacrifices, ceremonies, and origin stories that are confined to a particular ethnic group within a location. They don't reach out to gain converts. They don't try to recruit people.
Mm-hmm.
So that cannot compete with a system that does recruit people. At the very least, they're going to have more numbers than the sort of tribal religion. The parochial nature of tribal religions, whether they be African, European, or Arab, cannot survive in the face of a movement that is universal or has universal claims. So, Arab religion, traditional Arab tribal religion, where is it? It's gone.
Mm-hmm.
It couldn't was you can't find traces of it even. Traditional European tribal religion, where is it? You have people who claim to worship Odin, but by and large, it's gone. The irony of this Afrocentrism is that Africa is the place where you have Islamization, you have Christianity, and you still have traditional African religions being practiced.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike in Europe, where traditional tribal European religions are been extinguished, and the same is true for traditional Arab tribal religions. So this lament on the part of Afrocentrists is really unwarranted. The fact of the matter is that Islam in sub-Saharan Africa was an indigenous affair. That is, the African leaders, king, merchants, warrior heads, embraced Islam voluntarily and implemented it in their society on their terms. And that's the history of Islam in the sub-Saharan region. And those who disagree, I always challenge them with this question. Name the African tribe or ethnic group or nation in Africa that is Muslim today, who are Muslim because Arabs invaded, conquered, and enslaved them. And they won't be able to do it.
Mm.
There's not a single African nation in the sub-Saharan region. Now, we already talked about North Africa. North Africa was a racial amalgam, and it was an outpost of the Roman Empire. But the thing is that sub-Saharan Africa, on both coasts, by and large, were sovereign. When they embraced Islam, they were sovereign, and they remained sovereign for up until the modern age.
Mm. Mm. So I mean, that's another narrative that the spread by the sword narrative that makes its way into this conversation. Chancellor Williams made claims in his book about the destruction of African civilizations, which I find that odd because he named certain Islamic empires in the West Africa as being conquered by northern white Arabs. But is that historical? Is this historical that you just said it? But if we could get into it a little bit more for the audience sake, that these white Arabs from Morocco and from Algeria or wherever in the north, they came down and they basically put the sword to West African and Central Africans' necks, and it told them, you either convert to Islam or we chop your head off. And this is the origin now of the Mansa Musas of the world, because these empires. There's even there seems to be like a racist element to this, especially coming from the Eurocentric history of that Africans couldn't have possibly created the University of Sankore or these universities and all these libraries themselves. It had to have been the Arabs who introduced literacy to them. It had to be the Arabs who brought this knowledge to them and forced them into civilization.
Yeah, well, that's the subtext of all of this, is that when I said that there's an inferiority complex shot through Afrocentrism in the conscious community, a lot of them in those circles cannot conceive of Africans interacting with Arabs as anything other than servants or victims. They cannot believe that Africans were sovereign, autonomous, political agents who, exercised authority as hegemons in the region. And this is what's sort of pressing against this debate with Afrocentrists, is that you're trying to get them to understand and realize that, look, the king of Mali had Arab slaves that he would purchase when he went to Hajj and bring back with him.
Hold on now. Hold on before you go further. Africans had Arab slaves.
There were Arab slaves in sub-Saharan West Africa during the Mali Empire.
SubhanAllah.
But East Africa, everybody talks about Ethiopian or black slaves in the Arabian Peninsula during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. What they don't understand is that the Arabian Peninsula up to the Hijaz was a colony of the Abyssinian Empire. Mm. And there were slaves, Arab slaves, who were slaves of, East Africans. Mm. So trying to get them to see that Africans operated not just autonomously and as sovereign agents, but even at some points as, colonialists. Mm-hmm. Even Sheikh Anta is making this point about ancient Kemet and the new kingdom of Egypt, which was the imperialist phase of ancient Egypt. Africans have been practically everything in history. And victims is not the only thing. They've been colonizers and slavers. The thing is that, what's informing their view of history is where they are at presently emotionally. So, but in regards to Islam entering into sub-Saharan Africa, on the East Coast, Islam first enters into sub-Saharan Africa via the Sahaba or companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, entering there during the time that the Muslims were being persecuted by the Quraysh. They went into Egypt seeking asylum from the Negus of Abyssinia. It was granted to them. And even in like the Horn of Africa, because when you think of Abyssinia, we think this is contemporary Ethiopia with its present-day boundaries of Ethiopia and Eritrea. When you talk about the Abyssinian Empire, we're talking about Ethiopia all the way to Punt, or what is by some considered Somaliland. The first masjid, before the masjid in Medina, first masjid was in the Horn of Africa, called the Masjid al-Qiblatayn, the Masjid of two Qiblas, because it was established in Africa before revelation came down to turn towards the Kaaba. When it was established when the Qibla was Al-Quds, or Jerusalem. So it's the place, after the place of the first masjid, before the masjid was in the Arabian Peninsula. In East Africa, that's the case. In West Africa, you have the merchant class of the Ashanti embracing Islam. There's even a rendition in the oral traditions of Ouagadougou of how it was customary when the king of the Ashanti would enter into the royal court, people had to take dirt and sort of sprinkle it on their heads as they prostrated to the king. But the king exempted the Muslims from this. The Ashanti who converted to Islam, who were part of the merchant class. He exempted them from this, in part because of the sort of how lucrative the trans-Saharan trade had been for the people of Ghana. The Tokoro people who embraced Islam before this and are actually responsible for the war with the people of Ashanti, or the Ghanaians, who brought about the decline of Ghana. There was by all accounts, indigenous to Ghana, a northern Berber invasion of Ghana that brought about the decline of the Ghanaian Empire. And Conrad and Fisher, Humphrey Fisher, who wrote an article where they looked at the oral accounts within Ouagadougou, said that there's no mention of a Berber invasion. So the question you were asking me, well, where did it come from? Well, it comes from the Tariq al-Sudan and the Tariq al-Fatah of the Berbers, which is their account of what happened. They are saying that they invaded and brought Islam to the region. So the question now, and this is the difference between looking something up on Wikipedia and actually studying historiography. The question is, why do the African indigenous sources contradict the Berber sources on how Islam enters into sub-Saharan West Africa? And who do you go with? Well, if you're an Afrocentrist, you should be telling me to go with those of the traditional native Africans who say that the invasion never happened. Mm-hmm. The traditional native African says the invasion from the north never happened. So what would account for this, the Berbers saying that it did? And one of the explanations is that these are Berbers, not Arabs. Dr. Suleiman Yang, the late Dr. Suleiman Yang, talked about how Islamicization in North Africa was not like Islamicization in Sub-Saharan Africa. In Sub-Saharan Africa, they took Islam and they implemented it they infused it with their native African practices and identity. In North Africa, Islamicization accompanied Arabization. Okay. And one of the things you see with the Berbers up north is an attempt to try to win or court favor with they tried to join themselves with the glory of the Arabs in these military campaigns across North Africa. So they took credit for things they didn't do. That's what I think accounts for the difference in the account of how Islam enters into Ghana and what exactly precipitated the fate of Ghana.
So to piggyback on that, were Black Africans Arabized? We see this claim also that they were Arabized. They saw themselves as Arabs. They took on Arab names, and these Arab names were slave names, just like Washington and Jackson are slave names. The medieval Islamic Africans, would they have saw that way? Did they see themselves as being, adopting Arabization? Would they see themselves as having a Arab slave master name put upon them? You touch on that for a second.
Luckily, no. In fact, fortunately for us, they left behind writings where they sort of talk to us about their identity, their sense of identity. And I said Islamicization in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly West Africa, was an indigenous affair. And you see this in, for example, Timbuktu. One of the ways you can distinguish modern African art from ancient African art is that modern African art has the artist's signature because there's an art industry and they want to, but ancient African art does not. You kind of were a part of the village and you knew that this was so and such's work. You just knew that because there's the edict and the emek is sort of what's the internal, the inside, or to use this, inside baseball, or what you understand to go on in your community because you're a part of that community and you don't really feel the need to explain this to outsiders. And so from the you knew that this was somebody's work, even though they didn't have their signature on it or take credit for it. Now, one of the reasons they didn't take credit for it is because per the traditional African view, sub-Saharan West African view, is your talent is from the creator and it comes through you, not from you. So I said that to keep this in mind. When you look at the manuscripts of Timbuktu, many of them do not have an author's name on them, as opposed to we know that Ibn Arabi wrote this, the self-disclosure of God, or we know who Imam Ghazali is, or Jamaluddin Rumi. We know who they are, but we don't know a lot of who the indigenous African intellectuals and mystics were just by looking at manuscripts, because they didn't write their names on them. And the reason is because they believe that knowledge came through you from the divine, not from you. Now, that is a stark difference between sub-Saharan Africa and the madrasas there and North Africa or the Levant. It is a uniquely and very distinct African trait. That is an example of them being, or Islam being indigenized. East Africa, you have where they maintain or preserve the matrilineal line of succession and transference as well. Parts of West Africa, sub-Saharan West Africa, they maintain the patrilineal line of succession and transference as well. In those parts that were already patrilineal. So you don't see this kind of cultural adulteration that Afrocentrists and the conscious community keep beleaguering and talking about.
Yeah, so I mean, I even see within West and East Africa, they, like other civilizations, you come in contact with another civilization, you adopt certain things, and you may incorporate it into what you have, like the development of Kiswahili in East Africa, the use of Ajami script in West Africa, to using that Ajami script to document indigenous African languages like Mende and other languages. They used, in even the Ajami script was not exactly the same as the Arabic script. They adopted it for their use. So I mean, you see some syncretization and adoption, but that doesn't necessarily equal elimination of a particular culture or way of life. And to me, that shows the genius and of the African Muslims. It doesn't show weakness to me. I don't know how the consciousness community comes with that.
And it's weird. It's weird because no one makes this point with everyone else in the Muslim world.
Mm.
Like the same Afrocentrists don't see Pakistanis as cultural adulterers because they're Muslim, they're not following some traditional Indian religion, or those in Eastern Europe, Circassia, the Caucasus Mountains, Dagestan. It's only when you get to, or North Africans, it's only when you get to Black Africans does the racial bona fides have to be explained and defended in light of becoming Muslim. Now, some may argue, well, sub-Saharan African has to defend the Black African has to defend their religious bona fides because they're Black African and there's racism in the Muslim world. But one of the things that I try to point out in the book is that sub-Saharan Africa, East and West, were self-sufficient and confident in their own Africanity and Islam, that they were immune and impervious and indifferent to the opinions and attitudes of those up north or in the Levant, Arabs.
Yeah, you can see that in the fact that they stood alone. They founded empires, they founded caliphates on their own. They weren't as absorbed into, the Ottoman Empire, like certain other areas
And
were.
completely separate political philosophy and tradition from those in the north.
Mm-hmm.
Because those in the north and the Levant, they were locked into conflict with Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, and Persia. Sub-Saharan Africans were not, with the exception of maybe Nubia. But Sub-Saharan Africans were not.
Mm-hmm.
They had their own. There was no invasion or Arab or North African wars. All of the conflicts, military conflicts that took place, were tajdi, or movements where they were within Africa, involving African tribes and ethnic groups going to war with other African tribes and ethnic groups.
Mm. So let me transition to this. Now we got all that out the way, but the Afrocentrist, the Black consciousness person may say, okay, all that's good and well, but we know there was slavery. You can't tell us there was no slavery. You can't tell us that slavery didn't exist. You can't tell us that the Muslims enslaved non-Muslim Africans. You can't tell us that there was a trans-Sahara slave trade. There weren't slaves going off from the east coast of Africa into the Middle East. Just to quote you from your book, you say Afrocentrists and consciousness community assert that the Arab slave trade, and we see this terminology, Arab slave trade being used by the conscious community, and I would also being used by far right white nationalists as well, and evangelical Christians who try to attack Islam, is equivalent to, if not worse, than the transatlantic slave trade. So that's a narrative. There was a slave trade on the west and the east that was just as bad, just as extensive as the transatlantic slave trade. There was castration. It drained the population of Africa, which helped destroy Africa and allowed the white man to come and conquer. What about that?
Well, the challenge to studying for the historian, for studying the Arab slave trade, is that Arabs did not take meticulous records about slavery. And the reason they didn't is because slavery was not a pillar of the Arab economy and Arab society. Just briefly, the Arab slave trade refers to an on and off again period where Arab countries exchanged goods for the goods in Black African kingdoms. And these goods were gold, ivory, soapstone, and slaves. Now, slaves were a part of the commodities that Africans exchanged with the Arabs, but they were not the uniformly only commodity. So in the book, I discuss the Arab slave trade from two perspectives. One, its historicity, that is the actual transportation of Africans from the sub-Sahara to the Arab lands, and two, the polemic. So let me just say, first of all, that in terms of motive, nature, scope, and impact, the transatlantic slave trade and the Arab slave trade couldn't be any more different from each other. Mm-hmm. The transatlantic slave trade directly is responsible for the inauguration of the most expansive, wealthiest global economy in the world, in the history of the world. Slavery in the Arab world did not produce Arab wealth. So one was a wealth-driving institution where the money and resources and raw materials were used for consumable goods and reinvested into the economy that then fostered later on an industrial revolution. Whereas in the Arab world, slavery was followed the same custom and path as slavery elsewhere in the world, including Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. That is, slaves were captives of war who served in various capacities, from laborers, domestic laborers, guards, and soldiers. But in America, the transatlantic slave trade, the rapacious campaign to acquire slaves to fuel an agrarian capitalist economy noticeably destabilized Africa because it set Africa up for European colonization later.
Mm-hmm.
So one transatlantic slave trade set up the first major agrarian capitalist economy, global capitalist economy. And then after that took off and morphed into industry, industrialization, that industrialization drove Europeans to then colonize Africa, which they could do because of the transatlantic slave trade weakening the region. This was not the case with Arab lands. In fact, the historian Ira Berlin says that we need to always distinguish societies with slaves from slave societies.
Mm-hmm.
Societies with slaves are societies where slavery, more often than not, was a mitigating factor of war. This is African, ancient Roman, Indian, Asian, and Islamic societies, versus societies that are slave societies, where if you were to remove slavery from the equation, the entire economy would collapse.
Mm.
Those are two different things. And so when you talk about the Arab slave trade, you have to make that distinction. What is the Arab slave trade? That's a very lengthy conversation, which I'll be glad to get into with you. But for now, I want to also just point out that the polemic of the Arab slave trade, I think, is what you were recounting here. That when we talk about what is the Arab slave trade, why is it being so talked about today? It's being talked about because Britain, during the 18th century, had designs on East Africa because of its location and because it was suitable for farming to colonize the region. And the Arab slave trade was sort of conceived as a kind of propaganda to serve as a pretense for invasion and colonization. Because the people who sort of conceived of this were David Livingstone, Henry Stanley, Samuel Baker. These are the people who sort of conceived of the Arab slave trade as we sort of understand it today, with all the Mungo Park, sort of the horrors that are sort of dreamt up about it, as a way of saying, in an attempt on their part to spread Christianity, but knowing that that would not be a practical selling point for Parliament, Parliament joined with the missionizing motives of those men, the idea of this would be good for British industrial empire. And so that was really the origin of the Arab slave trade, because you don't find in any African indigenous sources, native African sources, any reference to anything that we call the Arab slave trade, which suggests that Africans did not see what was, their commercial relationship with the Arabs as something exceptional that, required that they write about it and combat it in the way that you see Africans doing with the transatlantic slave trade. You really don't see an aggressive campaign of enslaving Africans from East Africa in the Arab, coming from the Arab lands until the Omani period. And by that time, they were sort of acting as middlemen for the Europeans who had set up factories, who had set up shop in the East African and coast.
Mm. So, with that said, to to compare the transatlantic slave trade to, this thing that people would call the Arab slave trade, or some people even call the Islamic slave trade, and it seems ridiculous. It got rather ridiculous, and it's like you said, you emphasize the word polemic. It comes off as simply that, a polemic, a way to attack Islam, a way to attack conversion of we know that black men are the people who in the West who have converted to Islam the most out of any group. And it seems like a way it comes off when I hear it from whoever I hear it from, whether it's right wing Republicans, whether it's black consciousness community people. It comes off, whoever says it, as a way to attack the conversion of black men and black women also, but to Islam, in a way to discourage this conversion.
Yeah, they're trying to impugn Islam as being just as culpable as European Christianity was in arresting the development of Africa, but they can't, to this day, point out to you where Africa was underdeveloped as a result of what they are calling the Arab slave trade. I mean, when I say that the Arab slave trade is a polemic invented by British missionaries and parliament during the 18th century, 1700s, I'm not saying that there was not an Arab slave trade. I'm saying that the Arab slave trade, as we come to understand it, as being the Arab equivalent and the precursor to Atlantic slave trade, is historically false. Everything people say about the Arab slave trade comes from British missionaries and colonizers during the modern period, starting from 1700s, with people like David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley, and Samuel Baker, to name a few. These men were Christian missionaries who wanted to spread Christianity in East Africa, the areas of Djibouti, Mombasa, Kenya, and such. But as I said, they couldn't sell that. They couldn't sell the idea to British Parliament on the basis of religion alone. And because of the geography of East Africa and it's suitable for agriculture, it became a target for colonization. And just like before the major scramble in Africa in the 1800s, there was this sort of scramble for East Africa where you had the British and the Portuguese sort of dueling it out. But, others have pointed out what is problematic with this appellation of the Arab slave trade because it obfuscates the history. Like I said, there is an Arab slave trade, but it's not nice and neat to study. You can't name a source on the Arab slave trade that is not highly political and polemical and polarizing. Walter Rodney, those of you who don't know, was the sort of Pan-Africanist and Marxist who wrote the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He wrote in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, that the term Arab slave trade is a historical misnomer since bilateral trade agreements between a myriad of ethnic groups across the proposed Zanj trade network characterized much of the acquisition process of chattel and more often than not indentured servants. That I said you don't find the Arab slave trade in indigenous East African sources because they saw themselves as autonomous actors in this commercial relationship with the people to the east. So there was no need to sort of, you know, signify this as some devastating event that is happening to them the way Afrocentrists are making it out to be. Rodney also writes in the same book, the slave trade on the Indian Ocean, because he falls there. What people are calling the Arab slave trade in East Africa was actually the Indian Ocean trade. And it predates the Arabs by 2,500 years or more.
Hmm.
So before the Arabs were even a thing, you had this commercial relationship between the East Bantu people and the Shona people and the people in the Indian subcontinent region.
Mm.
Goes all the way back to ancient Harappa, which is the first recorded Indian civilization or Indian society. He says East Africa, the slave trade on the Indian Ocean has been called the East African slave trade and the Arab slave trade for so long that it hides the extent to which it was also a European slave trade.
Mm.
When the slave trade from East Africa was at its height in the 18th century, this is when David Livingstone and the others are conceiving of this idea of bringing Christianity to East Africa, but then have to sell it to Parliament. He says, at its height in the 18th century and in the early 19th century, the destination of most captives was the European-owned plantation economies of Mauritius, Reunion, and as well as the Americas via the Cape of Good Hope. Besides African laboring as slaves in certain Arab countries in the 18th and 19th centuries, were all ultimately serving the European capitalist system, which set up a demand for slave-grown products such as the clothes grown in Zanzibar under the supervision of Arab masters. So the slave trade, the Arab slave trade, as it is popularly understood, was conceived as British colonialist propaganda.
Mm. Mm-mm-mm. We've talked about a number of different subjects. We touched on these things, and this has been very enlightening. So, I'm sure it's enlightening to the audience. And you've said some things that, have been enlightening to me. Just one more point on this last subject that we just got done talking about. I would think if there was a such thing, if the Arab slave trade was comparable to the Atlantic slave trade, wouldn't we see Arab superpowers?
Yes, we don't. Two things. One, we don't see any sub-Saharan African land except Sudan, which is a separate category. That has a separate history because Sudan was tied into what was going on in North Africa between the Persian and Roman Empire.
Okay.
People don't know. Nubia was. But we don't find anywhere in sub-Saharan West Africa, for example, where, Arabic is the first language.
Okay.
In the same way that, people speak Arabic, don't get me wrong, of course they speak Arabic, in the way that you have French and English,
Mm-hmm.
which is not customary for people who've been colonized. Two, where is the Arab wealth from slavery during the Arab slave trade?
Because
If the Arab slave trade took place for as long as it did, and it was as brutal as it was, and it depopulated Africa to the extent that it did, where's the evidence of it today in the Arabian Peninsula? This is a question. Malcolm answered the question when he was confronted with it.
Okay.
So, no one has ever described in detail how the Arab slave trade arrested the development of Africa with the kind of detail that you can do when taking the transatlantic slave trade and pointing out how it has undermined the sovereignty of African nations. No one's been able to do that with the Arabs. In fact, during the time that they say the Arab slave trade was happening, Africans on both coasts were at their zenith.
Mm.
Even Chancellor Williams admits in his book where he wrote, the Renaissance in Africa occurred at a time it developed in Europe between the 15th and 16th century, and that both in Europe and Africa, Islamic sources were the catalyst. So at the same time you're attributing Africa's last renaissance to Islam, you're also saying that it's responsible for the destruction of African civilization.
And I mentioned that earlier. It seems like it's like a dichotomy going on. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. You know, it's almost like people are, as a polemic where people, depending on who you're speaking to and what you're speaking about, you'll say one thing. And if you're speaking to another group of people and it's a different subject, you'll say something the complete opposite of what you said in another venue, whatever it takes to make your point.
Absolutely.
And, you know, just to touch on the Arab wealth thing, you know, I've heard people say, well, we need to go after the Arab nations for reparations the same way we're going after United States and some other Western nations for this reparations. But when I look at North Africa, there's no superpower in North Africa. There's no you know, this great wealth that you could get, that you can trace back to an Arab slave trade or a Saharan slave trade that you can get reparations for. The same thing even on the Arabian continent. There is great wealth on the Arabian continent, but that came within our modern era with the discovery of oil. You touched on this in your book. You can't attribute that to slavery. And you made this distinction between a slave nation and nations that have slavery. But even Kemet had slavery. You know, the ancient Egyptians had slavery. West Africans and East African indigenous people had slavery. The Dahomey tribe. I read about the Dahomey tribe, which, you know, is the subject of one of the recent movies, The Woman King, that came out last year or so. And, you know, the controversy over that movie, because, you know, there was a tribe that engaged in slavery and enslavement, and has some connection with European slavers as well. But to tie that in with this subject, and a little bit earlier, we were talking about African spirituality, or so-called African spirituality. And I read accounts of, you know, not only the Dahomey tribe and other tribes taking slaves and enslaving hundreds, if not thousands of people, but even in their rituals for their religion, during certain festivals they would have every year, sacrificing their slaves to ancestors or spirits. So it seems the critique against
the conscious community, Afrocentrists, they deal with a romantic glorification of African history and culture, as opposed to seeing Africa as political actors who engaged in real life decision making. And as a theory of history, brother, as a theory of history, if you are engaged in war during this time period, if you are engaged in wars in order to consolidate neighboring tribes, kingdoms, and empires, the larger your empire expands, the more slaves you net. So because Islam was more successful at this, Muslims get blamed for slavery. But the fact is that the Oyo Empire, who observed, you know, Yoruba, were the largest indigenous African empire besides the Muslims, and the Oyo Empire had as many and more slaves than Songhai or Sokoto Caliphate.
Then why do Afrocentrists and the Black consciousness community absolve them of any, you know, if you can even put guilt on the subject, because almost every civilization engaged in slavery to some extent. Why is that not mentioned? Why is there no polemic against them? Why is there a polemic against Muslims instead?
Because they have no intellectual integrity, and many of them are simply not well read. It's not just a case of them not being well read; they're indifferent to the facts. They simply don't feel that it's necessary. They have moralized history to the point that the literature, historical literature, is no longer relevant. They exist in a sort of post-fact era. And look, history, scholarship in history is 7 questions. 7 questions. $150,000 education right here for free. Historical scholarship is 7 questions. What, where, who, when, where, how, what, who, when, where, why, sources.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Who did this? What happened? When did it happen? Why they do this? How they do this? What were the motives for it? Where'd you get this from?
Mm-hmm.
Who told you this? And the way you sort of, expose a fraud, an intellectual fraud, is you ask them very specific questions about what they said.
SubhanAllah.
The most telling one is, where are you getting this from? Because if you tell me where I got it from, then I can look at it, and now you and I can have a conversation about what you're claiming to have looked at.
Brother, you have thoroughly educated me in the audience. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on to the show. And, I hope people, if you're viewing this, of course, like the program. We don't beg and ask money from people, but if you took time to watch this and you gain something from it, at least like it and share it with somebody. Share it with, if you know somebody in the Black consciousness community, if you know someone is into Afrocentrism, you know somebody who's into so-called I'm spiritual and not religious, any of that, share this program with them and have a conversation. I do stuff like this so I can spark conversation with people. And not that we're dictating policy to people. We're telling you what to think. Engage with the material. Engage with the material. And I highly suggest that you get the brother's book, because what we were talking about in this 2 hours goes into much greater detail inside the book. And maybe we can get the brother back again so we can, there's a lot of things that we could have talked about in greater detail. There's a lot of things we didn't even get into. We didn't get into Islam in the Americas. We didn't get into the African slaves bringing Islam into the Americas, bringing Islam to North America, into South America, into the Caribbeans. What effect Islam had on these areas and the slave revolts. So if anybody would try, it's just mind blowing that anybody would try to claim that Islam is a slave religion and that Islam has the same effect on African Americans or even South Americans and Caribbean people that Christianity or some other ideologies had on them. The record doesn't bear that. The facts just don't bear that. And we didn't even get into the modern era. We didn't talk about Islam within the last 100 years, Islam in New York, Islam in Detroit, Islam in different areas, and how it's had an effect on the civil rights era, how it had an effect on the Black Power and Black liberation, how is it having an effect on African Americans today, and whether or not should African Americans even look into Islam or consider Islam. There's a lot of different things that we could have talked about, but there's time is of the essence, and there's only so much we can talk about. I'd like to have you on again. If you could pass the word to the brother Hakeem. I'd like to have him on the show. I like to discuss, him being a lawyer, discuss, our imprisoned brothers, our imprisoned brethren, and the whole policing in the United States and systemic racism. And again, I really thank you. And I'm not blowing smoke up your nose. When I started this podcast, I had you and the brother in mind, and I made dua for you brothers to eventually come onto this program.
Well, I appreciate it. I hope
No,
you
no,
weren't
indeed, no,
disappointed.
indeed, brother.
Oh,
No, indeed, brother. Jazakallah khair, and assalamu alaikum to you. Wa alaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum.